and welcome back. A couple months ago, I was surfing through Reverb, looking at some various listings of vintage Gretsch snares. I came across a listing for a single tension Gretsch round badge snare, and as I was checking out the listing further, I was surprised to see it listed from my old employer, Morgan Music. When I was in college in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, I worked at the store teaching lessons and doing sales on the retail side. A few weeks later, while I was in town playing at a local jazz club, I decided to stop by the store with a cash offer much lower than the listing price. Luckily, I was able to finagle a little bit of a former employee discount and got this drum at a killer price and moved on to my gig. This drum was in surprisingly good shape for its age, which from some old Gretsch catalogs I found online, I estimated to be from the mid-1950s. If my research was correct, this was part of a junior package that was often sold with a 24x12 matching single tension bass drum. I played it a little before doing any work, but I knew I'd really like to refresh this drum by 1, cleaning up the hardware and greasing the threads, 2, getting some heads that were a better fit for the age of this drum, and 3, refinishing the shell. I know some people enjoy the aged look of paint flaking off, and honestly, I don't hate it either, but I did find it to be flaking off quite a lot, and if this paint has lead in it, it's not something I wanted flaking off onto the floor and one of my dogs eating up. So I decided I would refinish this shell entirely. I started with the same as any other project, removing the tension rods, rims, heads, and then any hardware screwed onto the shell. Everything came off easily with no stripping of old screws or anything like that. Once I had the shell completely stripped, you could really see the fade and wear of the finish over the years by how much more vibrant the blue color was towards the edges where they were covered up by the drumhead collars. You could also get a much better look at the flaking of the paint and get a better idea of why I wanted to refinish this shell. The next step for me was collecting all the hardware and giving it a bath in some WD-40. My goal wasn't to bring this hardware back to a like-new shine, but just to get rid of some light rust I saw and clean it up to be more functional. With this being a single tension drum, the hardware is pretty unique, from the long tension rods to the hoop claws, threaded nuts, and the pass-through style lugs. So if anything were to break or strip due to rust, I imagine it would be near impossible to find replacements. After I set all the hardware to sit for a few days, I went upstairs to my garage to start working on the shell. With the paint already flaking off all near the badge, I was hoping I'd be able to scrape it away with a plastic razor blade. This worked for a while, but after I got far enough away from that initial flaked off area, the paint was bonded too well to the shell to simply scrape it off. I switched over to my orbital sander and carefully worked my way sanding through the finish. With this thin shelled snare, I didn't want to get going with something too coarse, but obviously it needed to be at least somewhat abrasive to wear down through the paint finish. After about 15 minutes, I had worked my way around the rest of the shell and was left with a very clean blank canvas. As you can see, I didn't remove the badge because this has always been a pain of a process for me, and the grommet wasn't the style that would allow me to bend the flange and reuse it after the fact. Luckily, this spot of the shell had the most initial flaking, so it wasn't difficult to get most of the paint off, even right next to the badge. So now, with a fully bare shell, I took this drum back to my desk to tape up the inside, bearing edges, and badge before I could start refinishing. I started by covering up any holes with a piece of tape or two to stop the stain from creeping through, and then I added another layer of tape around the entire circumference of the interior. There's probably a better way to do this, but I've not had luck when using masking paper on the inside of a shell, so I'd rather just use the extra tape and have a tight bond around the entire area in order to not ruin that classic Gretsch silver sealer finish. For the bearing edges, I just lay tape with some excess hanging off the edge and then come back with a razor blade to cut the tape as crisp as I can. And unfortunately, my camera battery died right before finishing up the edges, but I also added tape over the badge and cut it tight with a razor blade to keep anything from spilling onto the badge as well. After I had the drum completely taped up, I came up to my garage to start with staining. I ended up choosing this Minwax Early American stain as it's a color I've used on a lot of home projects as well as drums, and I think it has a nice vintage aged look to it. I'm really fond of darker wood stains on drums, but I didn't want to go too dark as I still wanted to appreciate the wood grain and have the badge and hardware pop out a little bit from the shell. I applied 2 coats of stain with a rag, giving each coat a few hours to sit and dry. After staining, I set up this shell on my Lazy Susan wheel to begin the process of adding spray polyurethane to the shell. I absolutely love using spray poly as it's much easier to do lighter coats and can save a lot of effort in sanding after each coat dries. I decided to use a semi-gloss finish, and over the next day I applied 3 coats. The sheen is fairly glossy, but not to the level that feels out of character for a vintage drum, in my opinion. While waiting for the final coats of poly to dry, I went back downstairs to check on the hardware and poured all the WD-40 back into the container as it's reusable. I then dried off all the hardware by hand before leaving it to dry out completely on a towel. The only hardware I wasn't able to soak in WD-40 were the hoops. So instead, I opted to polish these up with Brasso. This process is pretty straight ahead, but it always takes more time than I think. My only advice with Brasso is to regularly switch out whatever kind of cloth you're using so that you can get all the solution off whatever you're polishing. As you can see, once I got the first hoop done, the Brasso makes a huge difference. It's a cheap and quick solution for this kind of thing, and if I were going for a like new finish on this hardware, I'd probably do the same to the lugs, tension rods, and claws as well. Once I had all the hardware ready to go, I went back to grab my shell and begin removing all of the tape. On these older Gretsch shells, it's important to be careful with removing the tape on the inside of the shell in order to not strip away any of the silver sealer. But once I had it all off, I could really start to get a feel for what this drum was going to look like. Next, I moved on to adding all of the hardware back to the shell, starting with the single point pass-through lugs. With only one screw to attach these, it's important you make sure that the hole for the tension rod to pass through is as straight as you can get it. Next, I added the snare throw and butt plate. And once I had both of those back on, I added some bearing edge conditioner to these edges before seating the heads. This is a product by Drum Dial that I found to be useful on vintage drums and just helps to seal up any voids in the plies of the shell and protects it. I don't use it too often on modern drums, but I always find it to be worthwhile on vintage shells. For the heads on this drum, I chose to use a Remo Fiberskin Diplomat on top and a standard Hazy Ambassador for the resonant head. I wasn't a big fan of the original heads on this drum, and I think these heads are much more era appropriate for the age of this shell. I don't have too much experience with single tension drums, and for a newbie like me, putting these heads on and tuning was stressful at first. It's tricky to get all the heads and hoops on before even beginning to add tension rods and the nut for the tension rods. I definitely added some of the nuts on upside down at first, and I think I even threaded one of the tension rods without passing it through the lug. So mistakes were made and lessons were learned. Before I added the tension rods, I added some white lithium grease to help keep these threads turning smooth without much friction. I would highly encourage you to do the same when working on vintage drums. When I first got this drum, I felt a fair amount of resistance when trying to tune it up, and it wasn't even that tight. Once I added the grease, I felt almost no resistance on the threads, even when cranking this drum up pretty high. After getting all the tension rods in place, I could go ahead and add the snare wires, which happened to be original to this drum. And after that, this project was finished. I've recorded a demo with 3 different tunings and a few different style examples. After those play through, I'll share my thoughts on this drum and the project as a whole. After putting this drum through a variety of tunings, I was really impressed by how much it could handle. For a long time, I viewed single tension drums as pretty one-dimensional, and when I first picked up this drum, I feared it may not be able to handle much tension given the age of the hardware and the thin shell. Knowing that this drum was designed and sold as a junior level instrument, I didn't have high hopes for its tone or functionality, but I really couldn't have been more wrong. This drum has something to offer that none of my other snares do. It has an extremely dry tone, but still very warm. When I play it, it almost feels like I'm playing on a 200-year-old colonial marching drum. I'm sure the head choice has something to do with it, but I think the thin shell and lightweight hardware has something to do with it as well. When I pick this drum up, I'm still surprised by how light it is. I probably wouldn't choose to have a single tension drum as my primary snare, but I've really enjoyed getting to know this drum. It's a different experience in tuning, but also a different sound. Obviously, it's limiting not being able to change the interval between the top and bottom head, but it's a nice contrast to almost all of my contemporary drums. There are a few things I'm not a fan of with this drum, and the first is the throw-off, but not for reasons you'd expect. A lot of the throw-offs on vintage drums tend to loosen up and not hold snares tight for extended periods of time, but so far, this throw has held tension very well. The gripe I have with this throw is its design. The arm for the throw-off sits above the rim, which makes it an obstacle while playing. Depending on where the throw is positioned, it could get in the way for rim clicks, brushes, or general playing. It's not the biggest issue, considering you can just put the throw in a place where it wouldn't get in the way, but this just feels unnecessary. My only other issue with this drum is the straight hoops and claws. It's not really a complaint, but more of an adjustment. With the claws coming over the hoops, it creates a number of spots across the drum where you can't really play a rim click effectively. Again, not a major issue, but just something you have to be aware of. The other factor to consider with straight hoops is the way they eat up sticks when playing rim shots. Luckily, I don't expect to be bashing rim shots on this drum too much, but as I've played on it, I've seen some more wear on my sticks. Overall, I'm extremely excited with how this drum turned out, and I know it'll be in the rotation in my home studio. I don't think I'll be bringing it out on gigs regularly, but for a nice, light jazz gig, I wouldn't be afraid to take this thing out and depend on it to hold up for a few hours of playing. For me, collecting drums is just as much about the story as it is about the build or value of the drum. With this drum coming from a town I used to live in and a store I used to work at, it has special value to me. And I think anyone who watches my channel knows I'm obsessed with Gretsch drums. If you have any thoughts on this project or single tension drums, leave a comment down below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel to stay up to date on future video releases. Until next time, thanks.